I'm going to walk through this portion of the lectures, but as I do, I thought it might be interesting to sort of do a little highlighting of it with some images. You know, when you start walking through manuscripts and it's all just numbers, you're thinking it helps to see it. So we're going to try to do that. There's nothing that sophisticated about how we're going to do it. I'm just going to look up images on the internet here for the most part. And now I do have the virtual manuscript room up, which we can use. The problem is, as we learned yesterday, on this screen, since the images are in black and white, they don't come up very good. And so we're going to be looking at other sources for how to get images. And it's not hard to find images on the web. And for our purposes here, I just want to give you a glimpse of what some of these manuscripts look like. So we'll be appealing to one of those very good scholarly resources like Wikipedia on the website. By the way, if you ever cite Wikipedia in a paper, that would be bad. But I can use it in class as long as we're just looking at an image of it. Okay, let's move on. Second thing I want to draw out about manuscripts, and that is manuscript collections. So let's shift to that. The thing I want you to observe is not simply that we have a lot of manuscripts from the 2nd and 3rd century. Here's what's fascinating, and I think really relevant for our discussion here, is that early Christians, even in this time, began to combine multiple books into a single codex. Okay. They put them in the same manuscript. So rather than thinking of the New Testament books as 27 separate little manuscripts floating around that someone later had to sweep together, what's interesting is in the 2nd and 3rd century, they were already sweeping them together by combining them into a single manuscript. So we have manuscripts that hold multiple books, a little miniature collection. Now, just pausing on that for a moment, when someone does that, it's obviously intentional. Okay? In the mind of the scribe, he thought those books belonged together in some way. Now that tells you something about canon, right? It tells you people are starting to draw lines, and something's in, something's out. These books belong together, at least in some way. They're associated in the minds of these early scribes. So you can begin to see the canon unfold, not just because patristic authors say something about books, but because we actually have artifacts of them being combined in the same manuscript. Okay, so these are called collections. And there's tons of these. And here's where we'll walk through some examples. I'll try to show you some pictures as we go. This won't be anything sophisticated. Like I said, I'll just be pulling these down from the internet. I am on the VMR here, the virtual manuscript room, but most of the time the images in black and white on this screen just aren't going to be entertaining enough for us here. All right, so let's just walk through the different examples of these manuscript collections. We start with the most obvious, and that is the Gospels. The Gospels are the most popular books in early Christianity, the most copied books, and the books that we have the most notable collections of in the early phases. And we see a number of these that are worth noting. Let me just draw out a few examples here. The first is P75. P75, if I can find an example of this, is a copy of a manuscript that contains both Luke and John. Luke and John in the same text. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can see on the screen here, this is P75. I know that this doesn't have the zooming capability that you would like to have here. But you can see here, if you can follow my cursor, Euangelion kata Lukon. Interesting. So this is the end of Luke on a page. Okay, so that sometimes they have the title at the beginning of a book, and sometimes they have the title at the end of the book, and some manuscripts have the title at both places. So they'll say Gospel Luke, and then they give you the Gospel Luke, and they end it and say, that was the Gospel Luke, basically. And then they give you the Gospel John, and on it goes. Okay. Now, several things to notice about this folio. This is interesting, P75. P75 is dated to the end of the 2nd, early 3rd century. This is roughly the same date as P66, which we looked at before. And I want you to notice the shape of this. Look how narrow it is. This is just one of those interesting things that scribes just did books differently. Some are narrow, some are fat. Narrow codices were not unusual during this time period. And I can't get into all the reasons why, but when you use papyri, it was not unusual the way papyri would be cut to have long, narrow pages. When we get to parchment later, this is a little bit to Ann's question, when we get to parchment later, the pages become squarer. Okay? In fact, when you look at Sinaiticus, it's a parchment page, it's very square. Here it's very narrow. Okay? This is not unusual in the early centuries and actually helps us to date it earlier. Okay. Now you can see this scribe, looks a little bit like P66. You got a quasi-type margin here. I want you to notice the nomina sacra right there. Notice the title here, Euangelion Wanein, Kata Wanein. This is the Gospel according to John. And look, this is what we just read. En arche hein ha logos. There it is again. Look at the nomina sacra here. This is the prologue of John that you just read out of P66, and here it is in P75. This is P75 again, roughly the same time period. Now, if you were looking at this page, and this isn't the only page, what do you think is noteworthy about Luke and John being on the same page?
Like, we can totally off here, but like the order we have the Gospels in our canon, they already were ordering them in that same way, Matthew through John.
Okay. Here's an interesting observation, is that this tells us about the order of at least two Gospels. Okay. It tells us that Luke came before John. Now, that's fascinating on all kinds of levels, okay? One of the reasons it's fascinating is because it matches our modern day order, but that's not really a good way to say it, because the better way to say it is our modern day order is just the old order, right? And the reason we have it this way is because it was like that a lot in early Christianity. What's curious is that when early Christians started using the Gospels, we have a remarkable amount of uniformity in terms of the order they came in. There's studies about this, and by the way, we have orders all over the place, okay? So just every order you can dream up was there somewhere. But leaving that aside, there were predominant orders. And I can tell you this, the predominant order was Matthew first and John last. And then Mark and Luke would be moved around a little bit. But it was usually Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And in the early church's mind, why did they order it that way? You want to remember? Augustine thought this. TJ?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, Matthew echoes the Old Testament. So that first.
Could that be one reason why they think, okay, we're going to start with a book that looks like it's finishing the story of the Old Testament? Why else did the early church fathers order it, in their mind at least, this way?
I think that was the order it was written.
Yes. Okay. They thought that the order these books came in the canon were the order they were written in. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John last. What's curious about this is that they thought Matthew was first. Okay, not Mark. Now, this changed over time. Augustine later said, well, maybe Mark was first, and they went round and round. So there's not an absolute rule here, but it is interesting to see the uniformity of order. When you look at Luke coming before John, this suggests this is reflecting a standard order. So if that's the case, what scholars have done, they've hypothesized that if Luke and John were in a codex, and they were in the codex in this order, then Matthew and Mark are probably in the same codex. We don't have Matthew and Mark in this codex. I mean, we don't have enough sheets to know. Okay, it's fragmentary. But the hypothesis is if you have this, then you have all four. So scholars have suggested that P75 is a four-gospel codex from late 2nd, early 3rd century. Now, just pausing on that for a moment. If someone says, oh, no one knew what gospels to read in the ancient church, everybody's reading everything, there's no uniformity at all, well, you could correct that by what we did yesterday by looking at the patristic testimony. You could also correct it by doing something like this. Wait a second, at least some people thought these books belong together. One of the things that I'll point out in a moment, which is a fascinating fact, is that when we look at the canonical gospels in manuscripts, we never, ever find an apocryphal gospel in the same manuscript with a canonical gospel. That's just, you just need to make a note about that. We have some canonical gospels that are in a solo manuscript, P66, we did that yesterday. We have some manuscripts that may only have two, P75 could be that, although I think it was a fourfold gospel. But we don't have anything that has, say, Matthew, Luke, and Thomas. Or Matthew, John, and the Gospel of Peter, or something like this. There's no jumbling of these. Anywhere. You have apocryphal Gospels that are by themselves, but you don't have apocryphal Gospels with canonical Gospels in the same codex. That is really noteworthy. Now, it wouldn't be that noteworthy if they weren't combining Gospels ever, but they are starting to combine Gospels. The question is, it seems in the mind of the scribes, there are certain Gospels that don't belong together. You notice there's just certain Gospels that don't fit together. This is telling us something about the canon. Okay, let's look at a second example here. And that is P464 and 67. I might have to do a search on this one because this is the kind of thing that if someone doesn't know, Wikipedia is not going to know. Tell you what, let's do this. Let me just pull up 64 and 67 on here, and that. Oh, they did. Look at that. They did do it. How about Wikipedia? Look at that. Let's see. It's P4 though. I think has the bigger. All right, you can begin to see a little bit here. This is not a good picture. This is a fragment of P4, and it goes with another couple copies that are called P64 and P67. Let's see if this is any better of a picture. A little bit. Here's the main thing I want you to see about this. This particular fragment comes from the late 2nd century, okay? And it includes Luke and Matthew. So the prior one, 275, included Luke and John. This includes Luke and Matthew in the same codex. But scholars have argued, including our Chuck Hill down in RTS Orlando, a good friend of mine and does a lot in the same field, has made compelling arguments along with other scholars that this was originally a 4-gospel codex. So in other words, just because it contains Matthew and Luke, it's the only thing we have left. Doesn't mean it didn't contain more originally. And the way they know this is by doing all the spacing and the page numbers and the working it out. They know exactly what is what when it comes to this manuscript. So this is no doubt, in many people's minds, a 4-gospel codex from the late 2nd century. So this is kind of like P75, but even earlier. All 4 gospels in one codex. Here's the other thing that's interesting about this one, and really sad. I mean, we're not doing an analysis of this, but here, if you can't tell, what's interesting about this particular manuscript is it has 2 columns. A column here and another column here. This is pretty developed for the 2nd century. And it tells you the scribes were actually pretty sophisticated doing this sort of thing. This is an interesting study of the way codicology can work. Codicology, remember, is the study of how the codex is built, and therefore you can learn a lot about what it must have held. And the conclusion here is that 64, 67, and 4 all were part of, originally, the same codex. There's a sort of a color version of it. It looks like there's some sort of zoom-in feature here. You can see a little bit of it. I wonder if the virtual manuscript room might have a better version of this. Let's see if we can pull it up. All right, this could give us a little bit of a better version of it. Let's see here. Luke. There, that looks like a good one. Let's see if we can pull up its own page. Well, not great. You're like, that's looks like a big blob. Looks like one of those, psychology tests where they give you an ink blob. Like, what do you see here? Yeah, thank you. It's not P4. Well, look, it's hard to pull these images up, but you get the gist of it here. P4, 64, and 67 is a 4-gospel codex from the late 2nd century, maybe early 3rd, which confirms exactly the kind of thing we're looking at here. Let's look at a third example, and these are just examples, and that is P45. P45, interestingly, has all 4 Gospels in it. We don't have to just hypothesize. Has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and has the book of Acts. What's interesting about P45 is, if I'm remembering correctly, the order of the Gospels is different. And this is something that we just talked about. But P45, I believe it's Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark, which is interesting. So let's see if we can find an example of P45. This is the Chester Beatty Papyri. Not a great image there. But you can see the remnants of this. You've got the fragments of the papyri, the center column where it was bound. All 4 Gospels plus Acts are here. It really is an amazing discovery, and this confirms what we've said all along, which is this is yet another example. This is a good example of the handwriting of P45. You can tell it's a little more rough and ready than P66. Look how little the omicron is. Little bitty tiny 0, little tiny O here. This is sort of an angled slant here to this. And this was typical 3rd century, the way it's going here. 3rd century was very common, small omicron like that, slanted script. So you remember, we're dating these manuscripts largely by handwriting. So P45 is another example of this. Now, before we leave the Gospels, let me make another comment here about the Gospels that circulated independently. You remember yesterday when we went over P66, we made the argument there that this would have circulated on its own. It was a solo Gospel. Now, some say, well, see, look, they weren't being joined together. Therefore, this disproves this idea that people conceived of these books as a unit. Not so fast, because as I mentioned yesterday, the title of these Gospels is really, really important to note. The title of these Gospels, and Martin Hengel has argued this and has done a really good job, and there's also follow-up studies to this, that the titles suggest a plurality of Gospels that go together even when the title was written. Okay? You don't make a title like that if you only have one Gospel. You make a title like that if you have multiple Gospels that you want your reader to sort of associate with each other. So when you look at P66, which we looked at yesterday, the Gospel of John, it says, Evangelion Katawanen, you have to look at that and say, okay, clearly when that title was written, they were already associating John with something else. Now, it doesn't tell us what they were associating with, but the implication here is it was seen as a unit. It was something else. So this is already an important part of evidence for multiple Gospels circulating together. The titles are indicative of that, even if they later circulate as a singular entity. Now, in my Gospels class, I mentioned how early the titles were. We don't have time to sort of get into all of that here, but in essence, the argument is we have such an interesting uniformity of titles at a very early time. There's no way you could just simply argue that the church of the 2nd century arbitrarily gave books titles. If it was middle of the 2nd century and the church goes, well, we got to call it something, I'll tell you what, let's call this the Gospel of John. Gospels will circulate with different titles. Same Gospel would have conflicting titles. We don't see that anywhere. This is really incredible. Every time we see John, it's called John. Every time we see Mark, it's called Mark. That is a phenomenon that I think gives a very good indication for an early date. All right, let's look at, leaving Gospels for a moment, let's look at some examples of Pauline letters. So, it's not just that the Gospels circulate together, we even have early collections of Paul's letters that are circulating together. So it's clear that the writer or the scribe is joining together and assembling multiple different letters of Paul, and he sees them as a unit that would circulate together and belong together. There's numerous examples of this that I give in your notes. And you can see the list there. We're not going to obviously go through all of these. But we have the main example, which is P46. So I think there's a decent photo of it here. Let me see if I can pull it up. Oh, wow, it even lets you break it down into a book. Look at this. So you can pull up Hebrews. Oh, look at that. That's actually a decent photo. Let's see, Romans. Not as full. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 2 Corinthians, how about Galatians? Wow, look at that. This is interesting. So this is the end of a prior letter. Maybe 2 Corinthians, I don't know. Okay, so just a few observations here. This contains a complete collection of Paul's letters. We don't have the end of it, so we don't know if it included the pastoral epistles. But there's a bunch of discussion about whether it would or could have. But it includes a bulk of them. You can see one of them is listed right after another here. It's fairly clear handwriting. Look, you can even zoom on it here. This is pretty remarkable. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, according to, not according to the will of men. This is, and you see a couple of the nomina sacra, well, right here and right here, and right here. So Jesus Christ and God, is that Patros? So this is a fascinating little text, and it just gives you an example of the feel of 46 was our earliest collection of Paul's letters. One of the other things that's interesting here, and I mentioned this, is notice that it includes Hebrews.
I was going to ask you about that. Like,
Yeah.
like, is that why some, perhaps evangelical scholars think, oh, it's Hebrews is Pauline, or?
One of the reasons, yeah. I mean, what this tells you is that some early Christians thought Hebrews was Paul. And so they combined it within the letters of Paul. If we were doing a full codicological analysis of P46, we could talk about the order of the books here. I can't remember where Hebrews falls. So to tell us here. I think it falls somewhere in the middle of the Pauline corpus in this. Maybe after 2 Corinthians or something like this, I can't remember. But what's interesting is that usually the letters of Paul go in order of biggest to smallest in the codex. Okay? So it starts off with the longest letter and then goes down, 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 all the way down to Philemon, is the typical way it was done when you would copy it in the scribal world. So the order of the Pauline letters is not order of when they were written or anything like that, but just basically based on size. But this tells us that some people thought Paul wrote Hebrews, or that it belonged with Paul. Does that mean that Paul wrote Hebrews? Not necessarily. It just means that this particular scribe or some people in early church thought so. There's other times when it doesn't go with Hebrews. When Hebrews doesn't go with Paul. And so you got a back and forth manuscript collection that can go either way. That's actually a pretty good quality. I don't know if it's showing up very well on the screen there, but on my screen it looks pretty good.
Like, yeah, it just looks different from P66. Was this written like a different part of the empire, or like?
When you say it looks different, what looks different? Just clearer?
Yeah. Although I guess
It could just be the photo.
I guess parts of it were clear in P66 too, but
Our second sheet in P66 was
Yeah.
pretty clear.
yeah.
It's not that different of handwriting than P66. I mean, there's similarities and there's differences. It's a little bit more rough and ready. By the way, notice the line over the end of the omega here. It's Pantone, so that's a nu that's missing. We talked about that. This guy hooks his delta a little bit too, which I think maybe Eric just mentioned. Notice the correction here, Hamon over the line here. So, you know, the scribe's like, you gotta love this. I'm one line in. I'm already goofing up, right? He's like, well, I didn't even get past the second line. I've already left out a word. Well, maybe it wasn't his best day, but
I think it's like a little more like a couple more spaces.
it's definitely a more spacious manuscript than P66. Is that what you mean?
I just see like in the middle of it, like between some words.
Like up here?
Yeah, I just kind of see like a few.
The right margin is definitely not straight. See how the right margin kind of jumbled? This is definitely a scribe that's not as sophisticated as P66 scribe. That was a pretty impressive scribe.
What book are you in there?
It's Hebrews.
The epsilon is very similar. It's got elongated middle.
Yeah, which was not unusual for this time period, but yeah, it's a similar epsilon. One of the things that'd be interesting to see if the theta is that. He does do a wide stroke in the middle of the theta, which is, I'm trying to find a different example here. That is similar to, so here's a good example. You see how wide that stroke is on the theta, or the nomina sacra actually touches the sigma. Yeah, it's fun to poke around. I wish we had time to do it, but here's the point about this. This is one of our earliest copies of Paul. We have others too, I mentioned in my book and in your notes, that we don't have time to go through, that show that these books belong together or circulate together. This tells us about the canon. But let me make another observation about this, and that is, we have some manuscripts that maybe only contain a single letter of Paul, and people think, well, what do we do with that? But here's the thing, there's indications here that even single letters of Paul that circulated still belong to a larger corporate unit. What would those indicators be? And it really has to do with the title. What is it about the title of Paul's letters that suggests they belong to a bigger unit? I don't know if you ever thought about it before, but let's think about it. When you see a title of a book in Paul, what tells you that it may belong to a larger collection?
They're not just named Paul. It's the letter to X, you know.
Yes. Think about it for a moment. If you just had one letter of Paul, okay, you might name it after the author, which is pretty common. But notice Paul's letters are named after the recipients. So you don't have 1 Paul, 2 Paul, 3 Paul. You have Paul's letter to this, Paul's letter to that, Paul's letter to this. It suggests that you've got to distinguish all these different Pauline letters. So it's a different kind of collection. Okay. Now in the Catholic epistles, there's 1st and 2nd Peter and so on, but those are a collection of letters by different authors. Where now you have a collection in Paul, all from the same author. Now you have a collection all from the same author, then you're going to be naming it based on its destination. And so the Pauline letter collection is suggestive that way. The other thing that tells us that letters have multiple connections with other letters is the numbering. Think about it. You don't have a 1 Corinthians if you don't have a 2 Corinthians. You don't have a 2 Thessalonians unless there's a 1 Thessalonians. The fact that you're naming books numerically within the Pauline corpus tells you that there's already another thing it's paired with. There's already multiple letters of that. So this is interesting. That tells you there was connectivity between these books at quite an early time period. We never really did much more than Gospels and Paul, although we could talk about the Catholic epistles collections. There's a number of things I cover in my book on that, and also the book of Revelation. Now, the book of Revelation never really traveled as a collection. The book of Revelation usually traveled solo, interestingly. It was seen as sort of a fourth unit. Remember, there's 4 collection units in early Christianity: Gospels, Paul, usually Acts in the Catholic letters, and then you've got on top of that the book of Revelation. And eventually they start getting jumbled together a little bit later. But I thought, since we're talking about the Catholic letters, it was worth pointing out to you a different manuscript that I've done some work on that you might find fascinating. So on the board behind you is a manuscript of 2 John, which is very rare that we would have something like this, because 2 John, as we all know, is not a widely read text. But this is 0232, which is the Gregory Allen number. This is not a papyri. This is parchment. So back to Ann's point earlier about material, this is an example of how, by the time you get to the 4th century, things are on parchment or animal skin. Several things about this manuscript are worth noting. One is it's a miniature codex. Look how small it is. These are inches. 1, 2, 3. It's about that wide, whatever 3 inches would be. Okay, so it's about 3.5 inches by 3.5 to 4 inches. This is an introduction to the rule of miniature codices. I'm going to come back to this later and give you another example of this. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, it was not unusual to have miniature books that would hold texts of the New Testament. This is one of them. This is not papyri. It's a miniature codex. Notice that the handwriting in here is a little different than what you've seen so far. What do you notice about this handwriting that strikes you as different than some of the handwriting we've looked at thus far in 2nd and 3rd centuries?
It's a lowercase.
What's that?
That was lowercase.
Not lowercase.
Ornate. I don't even know what that is in the end of the first.
Yes. So notice how much there is these little flares, right, in the scribal pen. You've got this little loop at the end here, and the finishing of the mu here, and of the oda here. You got these little zings at the side, and here, and so you've got a bunch of different flourishes. I want you to notice here with the nomina sacra. Look at the way the nomina sacra is curved. By the way, this is a high-def photo. You can see, I could zoom all the way in on a miniature codex this deep. I mean, you can look at every little ink plot. But notice this ornate curve there. What else do you notice about this that's interesting, letter-wise? Yeah. Notice that the letters you looked at so far are sort of thinner and maybe longer, and these are fatter and squarer. Okay, this is on its way to what we would call sort of the 4th and 5th century unsealed texts, and we'll look at examples of that later. So this is the handwriting's changing, which is part of the reason we can see this. I want you to notice a couple other features here. Notice the enlarged epsilon here. Notice how much bigger that is. And see the space right here? This is the beginning of a new section. Space with the enlarged epsilon. This is a form of punctuation. You can see the Nomina Sacra here again with the Theou, again with sort of a little bit of a ornate curve. You've got a little bit of a large kappa at the beginning. So these are some interesting features. If you want to read my full analysis of this, you can go on my website. Don't do this now. You can go on my website and look under articles, and I have a full-length academic article on this. You can actually download it in a PDF from my site, and I go through all the different details of this manuscript. But here's the one thing I want to point out. You can't see it because it's really faded here, but in the top right corner right there is the number 164. So let's just let that sink in for a moment. 164, and on the back is 165. So you have a codex of 2nd John on the 164th page. Now, what in the world does that tell you? That tells you that in this book was not just 2nd John, and not even just 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, but something that went before it, at least 163 pages worth. So in my analysis, I added up all the potential space in this codex based on the average number of letters per page available in this one folio, and concluded there's so many thousands of letters available to us, and what could fit in those thousands of letter spots. And you went through all different options. Maybe the book of Revelation was in here. Could that have been it? Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. And I won't go through my whole thing, but what I argued in my article, and again, you can go back and read it later, is that this held the entire Catholic corpus, okay, which would have been 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and James. And then, in addition to the Catholic corpus, there was this gap of space that I had to figure out what might have gone in there. And really, it came down to only one book fitting in it. And that book was Hebrews. Hebrews was the only book that could fit with the Catholic letters in this little codex. And so I argued that what you have here is a Catholic letter collection along with Hebrews, from probably dating to 4th or 5th century. If that's right, then Hebrews was not always associated with Paul, associated with other letters. And that's, by the way, this is not the first time that's happened. It's not unusual for Hebrews to be lumped in with the Catholic letters at a later date. But this is another example of a collection, right? Notice that if you have 164 pages, there's other books that someone has linked here. And this is part of the point we're making. Okay, before we leave the collection discussion, let me pause here for questions about we've covered quantity, and then now we've covered collections. Before we leave collections, any questions about these things?
How do critical scholars address collections, particularly of books that they either say weren't written by the same author, or had, for those who argue that they were competing theological views being in the same collection?
In other words, what do critical scholars do with this evidence? It's a good question. This is, I think, one of the problems with this idea that the New Testament is filled with disparate theologies. Apparently, the people who put it together didn't think so. I mean, what you have to basically argue, which I think is a real problem for them, is only now do we realize these things have disparate theologies. Apparently, everyone in the early church was naive and didn't read text very carefully, and therefore just lumped these all together for no reason. And now it's obvious to us that they don't belong together. You get that line of reasoning, you think, wow, that's audacious. I suppose they might argue that, look, these are the books that were sanctioned and therefore they felt obligated to put together or something like that. The problem, though, is that in the early centuries, in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, there's no sanctioning body. There's no church government. There's no organized ecclesiological structure to enforce anything in the early centuries. So the fact that you have that kind of unanimity around books is telling. It shows you, again, by the way, that the Catholic view just doesn't work. Apparently, you can know which books are from God without a church to tell you. In any official capacity.
What about like the Pauline corpus, where they would say, well, Paul didn't write that book or that book or that book, but here they are.
Right. They would say that the early Christians thought Paul wrote them all. Okay. And that's why they collected them like that. But we know better now. Once again, that's a very frustrating line of reasoning there.